وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومطالي. يا سيدي يا سيدي، فأسألك بعزتك أن لا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي، ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري، ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي، من لي غيرك؟ أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي، أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك، وخالفت بعض أوامرك، فلك الحجة علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك، وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا مقرا مذعنا معترفا، لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة من رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة ضري، وفكني من شدي وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني، يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدأ خلقه وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي، هبني لابتداء كرمك والسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك، وبعد من طوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات، أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تبعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدا، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم يا رب. يا كريم يا رب. Together. يا كريم يا رب، يا كريم يا رب. وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثوه، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته، فكيف احتماله لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله، لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي فكيف بي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أضج وأبكي، لأليم العذاب والشدة أم لطول البلاء ومدته؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجاء عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، لئن تركتني ناطقا لأضجن إليك بين أهلها ضجيج الآملين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين.
يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين ويا إله العالمين، أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجنا فيها بمخالفته، وذاق طعم عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يحرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفه؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقه؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربه؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات، ما ذلك الظن بك ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عاملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاحديك، وقضيت به من إخلاد معانديك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كانت لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما، لكنك تقدست أسماؤك أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين. وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا وتطولت بالإنعام متكرما: أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته، وكل ذنب أذنبته، وكل قبيح أسررته، وكل جهل عملته، كتمته أو أعلنته، أخفيته أو أظهرته، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني، وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيته وبفضلك سترته، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلته أو إحسان فضلته أو بر نشرته أو رزق بسطته أو ذنب تغفره أو خطأ تستره. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي، يا من بيده ناصيتي، يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي، يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي. يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. أسألك بحقك وقدسك وأعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي في الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة وبخدمتك موصولة، وأعمالي عندك مقبولة، حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا، وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا. يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي، يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي، يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا ربي يا ربي يا رب. قو على خدمتك جوارحي، واشدد على العزيمة جوانحي، وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك، حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين، وأسرع إليك في المبادرين، وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين، وأدنو منك دنو المخلصين، وأخافك مخافة الموقنين، وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين. اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فأرده، ومن كادني فكد، واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك، وأقربهم منزلة منك، وأخصهم زلفة لديك، فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك. وجد لي بجودك، واعطف علي بمجدك، واحفظني برحمتك، واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا، وقلبي بحبك متيما، ومن علي بحسن إجابتك، وأقلني عثرتي، واغفر زلتي، فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك، وأمرتهم بدعائك، وضمنت لهم الإجابة. فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي، وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي، فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي، وبلغني مناي، ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي، واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي. يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، يا سريع الرضا، اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء، فإنك فعال لما تشاء. يا من اسمه دواء، وذكره شفاء، وطاعته غنى، ارحم من رأس ماله الرجاء، وسلاحه البكاء. يا سابغ النعم، يا دافع النقام، يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام، يا عالما لا يعلم، صل على محمد وآل محمد، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله. وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا. So we have some technical difficulties with the slides. So if you can pull the slides up on your phones, inshallah. Let's see if we get the slides fixed. If not, then. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. Okay, so alhamdulillah, we finished in this Ijtihad and Taqlid class, which really is just an introduction to how Ijtihad works. We finished one of the first of 4 sources of Islamic law, which is Al-Kitab, the Quran. And then we went through the whole Sunnah, alhamdulillah. We're done with that as well. Covered as much as we were able to in regards to that, although still it's a scratch of the surface. Now we want to move on, inshallah. We want to move on to a new discussion, the third of the sources that we have for fiqh and ijtihad. And so, thank you. And so, that is the concept of ijma'. Now we've all heard this term, right? And what does it mean? What are the different definitions of this ijma'? There's a big difference of opinion. I just brought 3 of the definitions that we have out there, but there's more. There's more than just these 3. And right from the get-go, you can tell something is wrong, okay? You can tell something is wrong because we don't have a solid definition for this. And you'll see what the problem is, inshallah, in a little bit. For example, some have said when all of the Islamic jurists and fuqaha agree on something. Some have said no, when the decision makers of the Muslim community agree on something. Some say the majority of the Muslim nation. Now this decision makers, the Arabic is Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Alright, but what we find in all of these 3 and more other definitions that I haven't brought here, the common denominator is Ahlul Halli wal Aqd. Yeah, Aqd. Yes. The common denominator in all of this is that there's a consensus of a group whose consensus plays a role in establishing Islamic law. Now, let's see what's going on here. Is it really a source of Islamic law on its own? Because brothers and sisters, do we have a verse of Quran that tells us ijma' is a source of Islamic law? We don't have a verse. Do we have any verifiable, authentic, reliable hadiths that tell us that? As a Shia, we don't actually. Now, there are some arguments out there. There are some hadiths out there, but the Shia school of thought doesn't really recognize those. And so, where does this come from, this ijma' that we've added as a third source for fiqh and Islamic law? Now, it's interesting. Most of what I'm saying tonight is from Shaykh Muhammad Rida Muzaffar, which is one of his books are used in the Hawza right now, actually. His logic book, his book on Usul al-Fiqh, these are all used. For 3-4 years, we study his books. And so he says, you can tell he's a little upset. And it's not just him. You check other books, it's the same thing as well. You find this in other books of Usul al-Fiqh as well, where they say, look, ijma', it all started from when? It all started in Saqifa, actually. What happened? Well, they wanted to choose a Khalifa, and what happened was there was no verse of Quran, and apparently the Holy Prophet did not have the insight. I'm speaking sarcastically here. The Prophet didn't have enough insight to appoint someone himself after him. So what is left? What happened? What happened was the people had a consensus. And they chose the first Khalifa to succeed the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Okay. Now, his name is not in the Quran, his name is not in the hadiths explicitly that Abu Bakr is supposed to be Khalifa after me. So then what is the reason that you're Khalifa? Well, this is where this whole concept came into the picture. It's interesting. This is a book of Usul al-Fiqh by Muzaffar, but then he goes into history and maybe a little bit of theology as well over there when he is introducing this concept of ijma'. And so he says that, no, it all started from Saqifa, actually. It all started there. This all of a sudden became a means, a tool, a way of establishing certain Islamic principles, Islamic laws, and so on. It started from there. So the first time it was used was there. Now, as time passed, they said, okay, if this can be the source of how we choose a Khalifa, it can also be the source of other things as well. So before you know it, ijma' becomes a thing. And so Shaykh al-Ansari, it becomes a thing in fiqh actually. So Shaykh Ansari, he has an Arabic line here. He says, "Huwal aslu lahum wa humul aslu lahu," which means that this ijma' is the rule for them, okay, and they are the origin of it. Ijma' was never a thing. Ijma' was never a thing. But now it has become a rule for not the Shi'i school, from the Sunni school of thought. It has become a rule for them, and guess what? They are the origin of this rule themselves when they chose the first Khalifa. And so from there on, this was used also for other aspects of Islamic law as well, ijma'. So now, so far what can we tell? We can tell that ijma' apparently on its own is not an independent source of Islamic teachings, Islamic law, and so on and so forth. And the answer is yeah, that's the case. Yeah, if ijma' isn't an independent source, then the question now begs to be asked, okay, so when we give the definition of ijma', where it's the consensus of everyone, does it necessarily have to be everyone? Well, for the Shi'i school of thought, and we'll get to it in a little bit, we'll get to it in a little bit, even if we accept ijma', you'll see that ijma' doesn't mean every single person out there has to agree to something. No. We'll get to that in a little bit. For us, we say, look, you have to be infallible or speaking from an infallible source. It's going to either be the Quran or the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. If anything else is going to have any bindingness, any authority, it has to go back to infallible sources. Ijma' is not an infallible source. Okay? And so even if you said Saqifa, there was an ijma', by the way, we still have to, say our thing, which is not everyone even agreed on that even. But assuming that's the case, right? If assuming that ijma' is a thing and you all were using it for whatever purposes you used it for, first of all, we say even if it is by your definition the main people that have to agree, Imam Ali didn't agree. Okay? And so there is no ijma' even according to your standards. But assuming that all that is the case, history and all that, let's put it aside. Let's move into fiqh. Ijma' on its own, does it necessarily mean when all of the Muslims or all of the people, the decision makers of the Muslim community agree on something, does that necessarily mean that they're going to be right just because they all agreed on it? The Shi'i school says, no, that's not the case really. And so now we're like, okay, scratching our heads. Then why is it we say the four sources of Islamic law are kitab, sunnah, ijma', and then we'll have aql later we have to talk about too. But for now we're on ijma'. Why is it that it is labeled as one of the four next to kitab and sunnah? When you say kitab, sunnah, ijma', that means just like kitab, just like sunnah, ijma' is also hujjah and binding and gives you infallible as if knowledge. Is that the case? We say, no, that's not the case. So here, Mudaffar, you can tell, he's a little upset. And others too. They're like, so you're like, so then why'd you add it on the list? So he says, we just did this because, I'm paraphrasing here, we didn't want to fall behind and we wanted to sound like them. For them, ijma' was a thing, and so all of a sudden now we're talking about it being a thing too. That's what he says. He says we wanted to use the expressions and terminology that they use. And so here we are now. Because you'll see now, we'll go into it more and more, but ijma', the way that it is usually perceived, we don't even have it like that. I still remember, this is one of those shockers for me when, growing up in the Hawza, when we were studying, when we reached ijma', it was so different than what we had learned all these years here growing up. And so, for me, it was a shocker. Anyway, so if we're going to use ijma', we said everything has to go back to infallible source, right? If ijma' is going to be used in Shia legal theory, it is actually a yaqini subcategory of sunnah. All right, and we'll get to what is meant by that. The same way khabar mutawatir is. What was the definition of khabar mutawatir? I have yaqeen, because this narration has been narrated so much, I have conviction, confidence, certainty that the Imam said this. It's impossible for everyone to have been mistaken about this. Man kuntu mawla, whatever that means, but we all know he said it. Why? Because so many different people and so many different sources have narrated the same thing. It's impossible for them to have all gotten together and conspired to lie, or all of them were mistaken in their narration. No, this is mutawatir. When it reaches the point where you're 100% sure that this has been said. Okay? When I say khabar mutawatir, do I put it next to kitab and sunnah? Kitab, sunnah, khabar mutawatir. We never did that, right, in our categorizations. We said part of sunnah is the ones that you have 100% yaqeen in, like khabar mutawatir. Some that you don't have yaqeen in, you have a dhann. You're not 100% sure, 80%, 70%. That's referred to as, khabar wahid. Remember, we had this category. So these are both categories of the greater sunnah umbrella, correct? Same thing with ijma'. In reality, if you want the Shi'i version of ijma', you know what that means? That means that through a group of scholars agreeing on something, you reach conviction and yaqeen that this is also the opinion of the Imam. How is that possible though? How is this possible? That from a group of ulama, I become sure the Imam's opinion is this. The question is, how do you become sure about that? Well, good luck. Tell me if you ever figure that out. Now, in the past, and the classical scholars that we've had have tried to somehow, explain it. Although today, you don't see any scholars really accepting these anymore. For example, Sayyid al-Murtada, or one of the Hillis, I don't know if it was Allama or Muhaqqiq, they say, we have this thing called ijma' dukhuli. What does dukhul mean? To enter something, to be in something. Okay? He says that when I see in the earlier centuries of tashayyu', I see the jurists all agreeing on something, or a big number of them agreeing on something, and there are some people in that group that I'm not sure who they were. Then that means, he says, some people might reach this conviction that the Imam is one of those people. And he's just making sure that, look at his face, he's making sure that they get it right. Okay? So if I know all 20 of them that are agreeing, then this means that I know the Imam's not one of them. So that ijma' won't have any value. But sometimes you'll notice that there's a bunch of them in the earlier periods, not now, not later ulama, in the beginning. Otherwise, now we don't have access to the Imam. But back then, apparently the Imam would sometimes, according to them, be one of those people that is part of this ijma'. Then you know, okay, since the Imam is amongst the people who are doing ijma' and are agreeing on something, then it's going to be binding. Now, why? Because there's infallible in there. And so, that's one exposition, an explanation of ijma', according to Sayyid Murtada. He says if it's ijma' dukhuli. So I look in the books, I find that in that period of time, there was like 40 ulama that all agreed on something. I know 38 of them. I know 27 of them, whatever. But the rest, I'm not sure who they are and all that. Well, the Imam must be one of them. And we're labeling him as an alim, but of course he's the Imam. Yes. Yeah, he's dakhil in it's called dukhuli because he is dakhil in that group. He is in that group. He's part of that group. All right? Now someone might say, how is that even possible? Well, thank you for agreeing with me. Okay, it's a tough one. And so you don't find any scholars today really believing in what Sayyid Murtada said. What about Shaykh Tusi? Shaykh Tusi doesn't insist on, oh no, we have to ascertain that the Imam is one of this group necessarily. But what? He says when all of the scholars of an era or of a period of time agree on something, it has to be right. Not because the Imam is part of that group necessarily, no. So Shaykh Tusi comes after Sayyid Murtada. He says, and you can tell he doesn't agree too much apparently with the Dukhuli theory. And so he says, if the whole ummah is agreeing on something, but it's wrong, that goes against the lutf and the law of lutf and grace of God. It goes against Allah's grace and mercy for everyone to be wrong of the Shi'i scholars. Right? And so as a result, Allah is going to do something. So they're taking it back. He's taking it back to Allah and His mercy, not to the Imam being part of this group. He says it's impossible for Allah to allow everyone to be wrong. Right now, one maraja says lobster is halal, the other one says haram. All right, one of them is right, one of them is wrong. So Allah lets it go. But if everyone says something is haram when it's halal, that means Allah is letting everyone be mistaken. And that defeats the purpose, that defeats this law of lutf of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it is incumbent upon God to rectify, to fix it somehow, to put ikhtilaf in these people so they don't have ijma'. Therefore, if there is an ijma' and a consensus and agreement of all the scholars, we can be sure God is okay with that. That means it's the right rule, not the wrong rule. Okay? Now, do maraji', do mujtahideen, do scholars of today believe in this one too? No. These things have been, I would say, refuted. No one really pays too much attention. But these are those big classical examples of ijma'. So nowadays, when we say ijma' is next to kitab and sunnah, first of all, we're saying that ijma' in and of itself is not actually a source, number one. Number two, we say it has to go back to an infallible source. Which three means that you don't even have to have everyone to agree. As long as the Imam is one of them, that's good enough for you. Even if 10 people are, and then 8 of them, you're sure Imam is one of them, then that's ijma' for you too. We'll get to some of the quotes on this, okay? And then you'll see that, I hate to use this word, but it's kind of like a mess, really, with ijma'. Now, obviously, there's lots of research that they've done and lots of papers and all of that. I'm not getting into any details here. I'm just giving you the gist of it. Yeah, there's other explanations too for how ijma' can be a way to reach this, to understand that, oh, God's opinion or the Imam's opinion is in agreement with this ijma'. There's other explanations I didn't want to get into. But having said all of that, when you're studying fiqh, when you're like reading a book like Lum'ah, for example, in the Hawza, you'll notice that left and right sometimes, or other fiqh books, left and right, you will find that they're saying, this is the rule because of this hadith, that hadith, and ijma'. This, that, ijma'. You're like, wow, it's as if the Shi'i denomination has no ikhtilaf amongst it whatsoever. Some of these classical scholars, half of the rulings out there in fiqh, they'll say, this is ijma', this is ijma'i, this is ijma'i. You're like, okay, wait a minute. What do you mean, ijma'? You're telling me this is ijma'i, but I know that there's others that might disagree. That's why I'm saying this is more of it seems, more of a reactionary type of approach, that we've had over the centuries, where we want to make sure that we use the language of others, to kind of show that, we have ijma' in a lot of things too. But is that necessarily the case or not? Well, that's something to think about. Now, when someone tells you we have ijma', it's different than when you yourself go and do the research to see if you check all 40 books of different ulama to see if they all agree on something. That's when you do ijma' muhassal, it's called. You do tahsil of it. You achieve it yourself. Versus when you're reading fiqh books and he says, oh, this is the ruling because of ijma'. This is now going to be called ijma' manqul. This is a khabar wahid on an ijma'. Sometimes a person comes and tells you the Imam said this. Sometimes someone comes and tells you there's an ijma' regarding this rule. Am I supposed to now accept it from that person? Not necessarily. So all of these discussions we're having is if you yourself go and achieve that ijma', by the way, which still is a big mess, still a big problem we have here, but None of this will apply if someone else is telling you there's an ijma'. And usually the ijma'as that we have are ijma'as that are manqul, that have been quoted and narrated to us, not that we've achieved it ourselves and gone and figured it out ourselves. So you see there's a lot of different layers in this whole thing regarding ijma'. All right. Moving on. So, no actual ijma' needed. Ijma' meaning the consensus of everybody, all the scholars. No. And calling it ijma' isn't accurate, he says. Mudaffar says it's not even accurate to call this ijma' that we have in the Shi'i school as ijma' even. Because ijma' means everybody. But we're saying even if it's not everybody, as long as the infallible is part of that group, even if it's two people, it counts. So let's read what these ulama say. Muhaqqiq Hilli, he says, therefore, if 100 of our jurists agree on something, and the imam isn't one of them, it won't be hujjah. And if he is among a group of only 2 jurists, it will be hujjah. Well, duh. But that falls under sunnah. It doesn't fall under, it's not a separate thing. You're just going back to whatever the imam's opinion is on things. We already covered that. This is not something separate here. Sayyid al-Murtada, if the reason for ijma' being hujjah is the fact that the imam is amongst them, then the ijma' of any group, big or small, will be hujjah if it has the imam in it. In other words, if all of the scholars from the beginning to the end, as some say from Kulayni to Khomeini, because they rhyme, all right, if they all agree on something, but you know all of them, that's not considered ijma' from a Shia perspective, because none of them are infallible. You see? On the flip side, if you have 2 people even, but one of them is the imam. But the whole question is this: how do I ascertain the imam is in this group? That's the hard part. Yeah, I mean, they're telling us the obvious. Obviously, if there's a group and the imam is one of them, we'll accept. But the whole problem is figuring that out. That's why Mudaffar, he says, therefore, naming the agreement of a group of Shi'i jurists as ijma' is a clear inaccuracy. The reason being that the term ijma' was supposed to be used for when all Islamic scholars agree on a ruling. Hence, just because the agreement of a small group of them can be hujjah does not warrant the usage of the term ijma'. Ijma' meant everybody, now you're using it for a small group even. You can't do that. This leniency in usage among Imamiyya scholars, which is us, has somewhat created another definition for the term ijma', and that is the agreement of any group of scholars, some or all from which we discover the opinion of the infallible. But once again, how do you even do that? How does that even happen? Okay, that's why scholars like Shahid al-Sadr, when you read their book and you're like, okay, let's read his book now. Shahid Sadr was, in the past 50 years or so. And so, and he was obviously killed during Saddam's time. But when you read his, and he's one of the greatest of all time when it comes to usul, when you read his books, you won't find these definitions at all. And rightfully so, like Shahid Sadr is not a person to play around. Right? It's obvious that these will not hold. These definitions, this approach. And so he'll take it a whole somewhere else. So far, what has everything been revolving around? The opinion of the imam. Right? We said ijma', if I can figure out the opinion of the imam from that group, and the only way I can find that is if the imam is one of them, then I know it's his opinion. Guess what? He takes the discussion somewhere else, like totally irrelevant. And I remember still, I was like, when we were reading him, we're like, this goes against all the classical definitions and discussions that we've had so far. Even Mudaffar doesn't take the discussion here. Mudaffar is pretty contemporary. All right? But even Mudaffar doesn't bring it up the way Shahid Sadr does. What does Shahid Sadr say? He says, ijma', he doesn't say revolve around infallible's opinion. He doesn't even bring that because he knows that's not possible. So what does he say? He says, look, when you have a group of scholars and they all agree, and this doesn't have to necessarily be all the scholars of an era. It's a big number. He does say big, a high number of scholars that all agree on a ruling to the point where you become sure that this must have been the ruling because they had access to something that hasn't reached me. Right? And so as a result, I become sure that this must be the ruling. What does it revolve around here? It doesn't revolve around the opinion of the infallible being discovered. It revolves around just the fact that I don't think this many people are going to make a mistake. And so he says, it's very subjective. And he calls it hisabul ihtimalat, probability. He says the more views and opinions there are that agree with certain thing, and it goes up in number, more. Every time it becomes more probable that this is right, more probable. Oh, Shaykh so-and-so said this, Sayyid so-and-so said this, boom, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. then you become sure. If you reach a point where you become sure, this is ijma', he says. But this goes against the classical definition of ijma' for sure. Right? And still, this. Now here we can put this next to kitab and sunnah. Did you find infallibility anywhere here? No. What you did find though is that, okay, there's something out there that they had access to that I didn't have access to. And that's why he puts conditions on this. He says, look, that means that it has to be the scholars of the classical, initial, early era, not the scholars of today. We have access to whatever they have access to. There's software and books published and all of that. No, we're talking about the Tusis and the Sayyid Murtada's times and the Hillis and those ones. Not even Hilli, maybe even not even Hilli. Who were connected. Yeah, he says connected to the time of the Ruwatul Hadith, the narrators of Hadiths. If these scholars that are connected to that era, so I'm thinking the cutoff is Shaykh Tusi and that, and everywhere, and goes from him before, not after him probably. Shaykh al-Tusi and before, let's just say, if they're all agreeing, or a big number of them are agreeing on something, and it smells like they had access to something that I don't have access to, and then the number goes up enough, then I become sure, okay, then that counts. And he calls that ijma'. He calls that ijma'. So, one of the conditions was what? That it has to be the early scholars. But there's another condition too, it's interesting. He says, if 100 of the early scholars agree on something, but I know their madrak, I know what they're using as proof for their opinion. I know that they're all relying on this hadith that's in this book. That's not going to be ijma' anymore. That's not going to be something that's going to help me reach. I have access to what they have access to, or what they were referring to. And so I can see what my own opinion is on that. It's only when I don't know exactly what they're referring to, and I feel like, oh, there was something that was in the books of then that hasn't reached me. And that is a possibility. And the possibility keeps going up more and more and more as the more number there is of people who agree. So he says ijma' refers to the consensus of a great number of experts. So he does say adad kabir. It has to be a high number of experts and those who issue fatwas on a ruling to a degree that yields yaqeen regarding the Islamic ruling. So you see, once again, yaqeen has to be there. Just like khabar hissi, there's value to khabar hadsi that adds up. Let me explain that. Hiss means physical senses. When one person comes and tells you, yeah, there's this place called China, I saw it. Then another person comes. Then another person comes. Each person that comes and tells you about something they've seen, slowly, you gain conviction. When 100 people tell you, then you're sure there's something out there, right? It adds up with khabar hissi. He says the same way, khabar hadsi adds up. Hats means to guess or to have an opinion on something, to do ijtihad on something. When ijtihadi opinions mount up on each other too, he says, they also have value and they add up to the point where you become sure there was something, right? So that's what he says. The more of these statements, the more probable it is they are right and the ruling is what has been stated. And there was evidence, for example, a reliable hadith that they had that never reached us. So Shaykh Sadr has a whole different definition and explanation of ijma'. My guess is because it's obvious, like the other ones really don't make the cut. And so as a result, brothers and sisters, we only have kitab and sunnah so far, really. We don't have a third thing really called ijma'. According to Muzaffar and others, they say that it's just there because we had no choice. Well, he didn't even say that. Just trying to use the same language as others. Yeah. And so with that is ijma'. There's one more thing left, and that is aql. Inshallah, we'll leave that for our next session. There's some stuff we need to talk about in regards to that as well. Any questions before we end? Yes? Okay.
For example, we don't see much, we don't have the references or madrak that, for example, imams have narrated, and earlier fuqaha had ijma' on, and in their books they did not mention the references.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. He says, is there at least one example of something like this? where we find in the books that the ulama of the past had a consensus on something, or a lot of them, from the early scholars agreed on something that later scholars don't know why they were saying that, and so we become sure that they had something we didn't have, he doesn't mention any examples, brother. So you'll see here in Ijma, and inshallah in the Aql section as well, you'll see that there aren't really examples for that either. That, we had nothing except Aql to come to this. Or we had nothing except Ijma that helped us here. Really, no, these things aren't really taken too serious. Especially since these terms have been used so loosely in the fiqh books. What's crazy is sometimes you're reading, it says we have ijma on this, but then someone else someone else claims that we have ijma opposite to what was there's ijma on. Well, you're like, okay, wait a minute, ijma isn't something like small. When someone claims ijma on something, there should at least not be a counterclaim of ijma on the opposite side at least. But then you find that that's the case sometimes even. So you can tell that this term has been used very loosely and for other intentions and other purposes in the past. We don't have to deal with that stuff too much anymore. But still, in the dars kharijes of today even, if someone has claimed ijma on something, it will be taken into consideration. Because the least is that you can be sure that there is a good number of ulama that have agreed on that, and so they'll look into it. Otherwise, you want an example where I give you that, this rule can only be proven through ijma, not through sunnah or kitab. I can't think of anything. He doesn't bring any examples either. And I haven't done a thorough research, obviously, but I don't remember anything off the top of my head either. I don't think there's anything out there. Yeah? Yes? No, they're not using that. Good question. So when the Ahl Sunnah, for example, they use theirs, they use ijma'. Although they have, as I said, they have different, definitions, and these are just 3 out of like maybe 5, 6, 10 definitions that I've seen. Like one of the definitions that I have not brought here, I saw was if the khulafa all agree on something, for example. If I remember correctly, they have that definition too. But no, they will have a different explanation than Sayyid Murtada or Shaykh Tusi. These guys are doing this because they have no other choice. Okay? But for them, they'll say, no, we have Quranic proof, and we have hadith proof. For example, that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تجتمع أمتي على خطأ. My ummah will not come together and agree on something that's not right. If everyone is agreeing on something, that means they're right. Okay, so they'll have hadiths that are actually establishing this rule. But as I said, the Shi'i school doesn't accept these. Yeah, we feel that these are not authentic, and there's a reason that these hadiths have been made or mentioned. Yeah, so they don't have, I haven't seen them talk about lutf or dukhuli. Obviously they won't have dukhuli because they don't believe in an imam that's going to be dakhil. They say the Prophet came and it's over. So they don't have, in their epistemology, they don't have other ma'sumin other than the Prophet. Yeah, so ma'sum in the sense of when it comes to Islamic law, telling not making mistakes there. They might believe in him making mistakes elsewhere, but not when it comes to preaching the deen. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, they have a dalil khas, a particular reason that proves that ijma' on its own is a dalil. Now it's interesting, one of our scholars brought this up once, I was watching, he was like, for them it's after the fact that it becomes a dalil. In other words, why is the first Khalifa was chosen? Through what? Through ijma'. Okay, then that means ijma' is a source. After the fact. It's not necessarily the case that from before they were like, let's have an ijma' here. Once it happened and he came to power, then they're like, okay, so ijma' can be a source because it worked. See, it happened after the fact. While we say, no, from before it has to be made something authoritative, then we'll use it. But I don't want to put words in their mouth. Practically, though, that this scholar was saying, practically that's what's happening. That they're making it a source, but after the fact. Yeah. All right, inshallah, so we'll have aql in our next session. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Inshallah. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام على الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. السلام على 9 المعصومين من ولد الحسين. السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان، عجل الله تعالى فرجك وسهل الله تعالى مخرجك وظهورك. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.